It seems to me that a lot of our talk about religion in our country tends to focus on the things we do in worship. And there's good reason for that. If we read through the Old Testament, we find that much of Israel's practice of religion focused on the times that God instructed the nation to gather at the temple in Jerusalem to worship. And as we move into the New Testament, we find something similar. We find that the church in the first century spent time together in worship of God on Sunday. Worship is a key part of the way that God expects His people to interact with Him. But in the years that I've been a minister and I've had opportunities to talk with people, in those conversations, worship tends to come up. And I've noticed a pattern in those conversations that I have with people about worship. In talking with people, and when we start talking about worship, it seems to me that very often people talk about worship like they talk about, for example, going to see a movie. It's something that they go to do. It's something they go to take in. Now, I'm going to pause for just a second. I was told that I am in charge of my own slides, and I know this is not my slide up there, so am I in charge of getting it started? She gives me a thumbs up. Oh, she did it for me, so there we go. They told me that. I had 2 people tell me that because I didn't advance my own slides yesterday. And then I started to, and then I stopped, so there's confusion about what I was doing. So they were making sure that I was on task this morning. Back to worship. As I mentioned in my conversations with people, it seems to me very often when people talk about worship, they talk about it like they talk about going to a movie. It's something they go to do. It's something they go to take in. We're going to spend a little time this morning in Psalm 121, which is a psalm that's associated with Israel's worship. It's a part of a group of songs that are particularly connected to Israel gathering together corporately to worship God. And Psalm 121, I think, offers us a different perspective on worship than I sometimes encounter when I talk to people about worship. In Psalm 121, the psalmist connects worship to a personal relationship with God rather than merely going to consume something, in their case, in the temple, or in our case, in a church building. And as we look at Psalm 121, we want to make sure that we try and understand it within its context as the original audience would have understood it. And then to make some applications from their world to our practice of worship this morning. Before we get into the psalm, however, let's take a moment and pray together. Father, we pray that you will help us as we look at this psalm this morning. We pray that we can gain some insights into our worship of you so that our worship can be pleasing to you and beneficial to us. We pray for your guidance, Father. We pray for your ongoing mercy and forgiveness. And we ask this through Jesus. Amen. Some beginning considerations, I think, as we think about this psalm. It was off, that's why it didn't work. Some beginning considerations as we think about this psalm. Now, remember, this psalm was not written to us. We are not the original audience for whom Psalm 121 was written. It was written for Jewish people that lived a long time ago in a very different part of the world than we live in. And so I think it's beneficial if we think a little bit about the psalm and the context within which it was written to help us think about the message of the psalm. And Psalm 121 belongs to a group of psalms that go from the 120th psalm through Psalm 134 that are often called the songs of ascent. And they were a group of psalms that were associated with the Israelites traveling to Jerusalem, to the temple, to worship God. And there's quite a bit of material in the Old Testament about the necessity for the Israelites to worship in that way. Moses, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, as he's addressing the nation at the end of his life, a nation that had been rebellious and stubborn and caused trouble for him, and now would shortly be passed from his leadership to Joshua's leadership. In Deuteronomy 12, we have him giving them instructions about God's expectations for them when they get into the land of Canaan. And he tells them over and over and over again in Deuteronomy chapter 12, when you get into that land, you're only to worship God in the place that he chooses. You're not to do like the people in the land. You're not to worship on all the high places, all the places that they considered sacred locations. Instead, he says, you're only to worship at the place that God chooses, the place where he will allow his name to dwell. We can jump ahead a little bit into Psalm 132, and we find the psalmist there in Psalm 132, verses 13 and 14, identifying Jerusalem as the place that God chose. In Psalm 132, it mentions the Lord has chosen Zion. Zion is another name for Jerusalem, as the place where he would dwell forever. And we find a few chapters past Deuteronomy chapter 12 and Deuteronomy chapter 16, in verse 16, that there were specific occasions when God required all of the Israelites to travel to the place that he would choose to worship as a nation in corporate worship. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16 mentions 3 feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, as very specific times when the whole nation was to gather in the place that God chose to worship him. So these songs of ascent speak to a really important national observance that God baked into the DNA of the Israelites. And the songs of ascent were part of that expectation of the Israelites to travel to Jerusalem to worship God. Now, I think it's important we take a moment and think about that expectation of travel. It's not uncommon for us to travel. We can get in our cars, we can get on airplanes and boats and travel very quickly to all places around the world with very little inconvenience for us. But in the biblical world, that was not the case. People rarely traveled in the ancient world. And when they did travel, it was usually because there was some pressing necessity. Like, for example, it could be warfare or famine or some family situation. And people didn't travel very often because travel was difficult, travel was expensive, and travel was dangerous. But despite those realities of travel in the ancient world, God required the Israelites to travel 3 times a year in Deuteronomy 16:16. 3 times a year when the entire nation was to travel to Jerusalem to worship God. And to travel to Jerusalem was not jump in my car, take an hour or 2 drive to Jerusalem, make it back by evening. For many of them, it could be multiple weeks of travel and preparation involved in that journey to Jerusalem. Multiple weeks in which they had to put their entire life and livelihood on hold. It was a serious responsibility that God had given to the nation in worshiping him. And that stressed what God expected the worship to remind the Israelites about. They were to put their lives on hold. They were to put their livelihood on hold in a world in which many people lived just day to day with what they needed. And to put their life and livelihood on hold in that way endangered them. And then they were to add that, the risks associated with travel to go to the place that God chose for his name to dwell. And there's a very important reason behind God asking the Israelites to do something like that. The worship that they were to observe as a nation at the temple or at the tabernacle, depending on what time in their history they were worshiping, was to remind them about the saving, rescuing, and provisioning care that God had offered to the Israelites throughout their history. For example, go back to Exodus. Exodus 34 offers us an important insight that forms a foundation for those understandings about God's care for the nation. In Exodus, we are with Moses and the Israelites. He's led them out of captivity in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they have met God, and they're beginning to enter into that covenant relationship with him. This is introduced in chapter 20 when Moses receives the 10 Commandments, comes back down, gives them to the people, initiating that relationship. But then he goes back up on the mountain to receive more details about the law. And while he's up on the mountain, after he's gone for 40 days, we get to Exodus chapter 32, the people decide he must surely be dead. And so they make for themselves a golden calf that they worship, announcing that this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. God sends Moses down to sort everything out. And in the sorting of it out, we find God in the next chapter, chapter 33, saying, now it's time to pack up and begin to move from the mountain, but I will no longer remain in your midst. This is a pretty serious change because up to this point, God had been in the midst of the nation in very dramatic, visible ways, but now he's announcing, I am not going to remain in your midst any longer. And he adds to that, why? because if I remained in your midst, I'd have no choice but to destroy you. That's Exodus 33, 1 through 3. A pretty dangerous, precarious situation, which prompts Moses to ask God for some sign that his relationship with the nation is not over. And that leads to God announcing his identity to Moses in Exodus 34. And this is a really important passage. This is a place where God defines his identity, defines his character. And this is what he announces to Moses as he passes before Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 6. The Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Now, there's something we need to notice about this text. That word generation, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version, is not in the original language. It's supplied. It's something that's implied in the text, but is not there because the author's making a contrast, a really, really important contrast. He talks about God's mercy and God's grace and God's patience and his faithful, steadfast love in response to the nation's rebellion. But he also acknowledges there is accountability, there are consequences. And that's where we talk about God holding people accountable to the third and fourth generation. But that's in contrast to what he says just before that. He extends mercy and forgiveness to thousands of generations. There's overwhelming mercy and forgiveness in God that doesn't exclude consequences, but his scales are always tipped in favor of forgiveness. This is what God announced to Moses, and notice Moses' response in verse 8. He falls down and worships God. This is the God who revealed himself to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. This is the God that brought them into the land of Canaan. This is the God who gave them a rich and bountiful land, who protected them, who provisioned them, who gave them their harvests, who gave them all that they possessed. And when he asked the nation to put their life and their livelihood on hold to travel to Jerusalem, it was a reminder, you are not responsible for making your life work. I am the one who makes your life work. I am the one who feeds you. I am the one who protects you. I am the God who revealed himself to Moses and continues to be the same kind of God. That's why they gathered in Jerusalem. That's why they gathered at the temple. That's why they gathered at the tabernacle. That's why they worship God, because of who God is and because he elected to enter into a relationship with them. And that forms the framework, the backdrop for Psalm 121. Psalm 121, which was a song of ascent, those psalms that were associated with the Israelites traveling to Jerusalem. And what I'd like us to do is read through this psalm again. It's not a very long psalm, but I want us to read through it again, and there's a reason. We don't normally speak or think in poetic forms. Poetry is not part of our day-to-day patterns of expression. It's a very deliberate, very artistic way of speaking that forms a really important part of God's Bible. About 30% of his Bible is poetry. And we don't engage poetry the same way we would engage normal communication. Poetry is meant to be something that we engage deliberately, slowly, intentionally. And part of that engagement is also experiential, the reading of it, the listening to it, that allows us to get access to the images and ideas that are part of the communication that the poetry is doing. So let's read through the psalm one more time, and then we'll look at the psalmist's material in Psalm 121 and try and make some applications from it. Psalm 121. And as I read through it, think about all that backdrop, about the Israelites traveling to Jerusalem and the ideas associated with their worship. Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. This psalm starts in a way that's a little bit ambiguous. When it says that I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? We're not told if the psalmist is looking for help because he's in danger or if he's looking to the hills upon which Jerusalem was located. It's ambiguous, intentionally so. It's setting the stage for both realities, our need for help as well as our source of help. But even though there's a little bit of ambiguity in the opening lines of Psalm 21, the next lines, beginning in verse 2, are very clear. The psalmist writes, where does my help come from? My help does not come from what I do. It does not come from my provisions, from my planning, from my friends, from what I have. The psalmist writes, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And when he writes that my help comes from God who made heaven and earth, this is not a statement of origins. It's a statement of authority and sovereignty. The God who made everything is also the God who rules everything. Every realm, every area, every part of God's world, every part of both this world and the divine world is under God's sovereign control. My help comes from the most powerful, the most sovereign being in existence. And there's no greater source of help than that declaration. My help comes from God who made everything. It was to be a statement of encouragement and hope, and also reminder for those people in taking upon all the difficulties and the challenges of traveling from their homes to Jerusalem. But notice where the psalmist moves next, beginning in verse 3. Now, as the psalmist talks about help, he begins to talk about what God does for the travelers as they're making their way from their homes to Jerusalem to worship. And he uses the worshiper's journey as a metaphor for one's entire life. Now, notice he writes in verse 3, he will not let your foot be moved. Traveling to Jerusalem, if you're not familiar with the geography in that part of the world, was a somewhat interesting experience. Jerusalem was located on the hills between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan Valley. And travelers coming to Jerusalem from the east through the Jordan Valley would have experienced extreme elevation changes. From the bottom of the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem was about a 15-mile distance, but in that distance they would have traveled 4,000 feet of elevation changes going up. And in addition to those extreme elevation changes in a really short distance, they would have also encountered rocky, difficult terrain. There were real physical challenges associated with traveling to Jerusalem. And part of that is implied in the psalmist's comment, he will not let your foot be moved. He's drawing on their experience of traveling to Jerusalem, but has in mind far more than merely the journey itself. Because as the psalmist talks about that journey, he talks about protections that extend beyond that journey to all of life. Notice the psalmist writes that he who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. There's an ever vigilant character to God's protection. He's always aware. He's always active in providing the protections that his people need. But it's not just in that journey from their homes to Jerusalem. These are protections that extend beyond that to every area of life. When the psalmist writes that he is your keeper, the Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. He's speaking to all those things about life that we know and we don't know. It's very often we talk about things that are known as things that belong in the sun, things that are seen and can be understood. And night is often used in our world, as in their world, as a metaphor for things that are unknown, things that are mysterious, potentially dangerous. The psalmist's description of God giving them protection in the day and protection at night is his way of saying he protects you all the time. He's always aware from the things that you know as well as the things that you don't know. The dangers that are at your hand and the dangers that are coming. God's protections, God's provisions extend into all those areas of life. And not only that, he safeguards you from all evil. Notice in verse 7, the Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. And not just in that moment of travel in verse 8, from this time forth and forevermore. Your entire life, the psalmist writes, is under God's protection. And that's why the people were traveling to Jerusalem to worship. That's why the psalmist in Psalm 121 uses their journey from their homes to Jerusalem as a way of talking about the motivation for undertaking that difficult journey. the challenges, the financial burdens associated with it. Because God is a God deserving of their worship because of what he does for them. Psalm 121 thus reminded people traveling to worship God of the reason that made that long and difficult and expensive journey. The protections that God extended over their entire life revealed his worthiness of their worship. The God who made everything. The God who is enthroned sovereignly, unquestionably above everything in the world, is the same God who personally revealed himself to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. The same God who entered into a relationship with them despite their rebelliousness, despite their stubbornness, and maintained that relationship with them. The God who continued to bless, to provision, and to protect. He desired a relationship with them. He was actively safeguarding his relationship with them. And so the psalmist reminds them, we travel to Jerusalem because of who our God is, because of what he does for us, because in what he does we come to understand him and we realize his worthy, deserving nature that motivates us to want to travel and worship him. That's Psalm 121. And as we think about this psalm then, we have to ask ourselves, what kinds of applications can we make from this psalm to our life? The Bible was written by God for a purpose. And Paul is pretty clear about that in 2 Timothy 3:16, 17. The Bible's designed by God to help us understand what we're supposed to do. Every part of the Bible, which includes things like Psalm 121. Now, things like Psalm 121 aren't as immediately obvious to us as some things like, for example, the book of James, which we consider a much more practical and obvious book to apply within our lives. But that doesn't mean things like the Psalms should have a lesser place within our lives. In part, just think about the amount of space that God devotes to the Psalms in his Bible. That ought to tell us something about his understanding of the importance of these poems and these songs in our lives. And so the challenge for us is to try and understand this psalm and the imagery and the meaning it would have had for the people for whom it was originally written, and then ask ourselves, what kinds of lessons can I take from this psalm and apply within my life? And I want to offer a few suggestions this morning. In the first place, I think this psalm reminds us that our worship should begin with a recognition of God's activities within our lives. That's part of what the psalmist is writing. God protects us. God provisions us. God does things for us. And that motivated their worship. And our recognition of God's good actions in our lives should certainly be a motivating factor for our worship. But as we grow in our relationship with God, it should move gradually beyond merely a recognition of what he's done for us to a deeper appreciation of what the things he does for us reveal about who he is. So that our worship moves from what we receive to the good, deserving identity of God, the character of God that makes him want to be a God that does things for us. And I think we have a good illustration of this in the life of Habakkuk. In the book of Habakkuk, we have an individual who was bringing a challenge, a question before God, saying to God, your people are out of control. And when are you going to respond to their wickedness? God's response is, that's a really good point, Habakkuk. I'm going to do something. Look out among the nations and be in awe. I'm sending the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to destroy them. That's not the response Habakkuk wanted. And so he begins to say, whoa, well, that's a little more than I anticipated. And how can you do these kinds of things? I don't understand your thinking to do what you've announced that you're going to do. God comes back to Habakkuk and he says, don't worry about it. It's not your place to understand. It's your place to submit, to obey. Now, that's a really difficult message to hear from God. But I want you to notice Habakkuk's response at the end of Habakkuk chapter 3, beginning verse 17. He's just been told God is going to severely punish his people in his homeland. And this is his response. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the oil fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And notice the end, that last little line. to the choir master with stringed instruments. This was part of the music that was to be a part of the Israelites' corporate worshipful life. It's a recognition, not that my life and my relationship with God based solely on the things he does, but rather is based on his identity, his character, that gives me confidence in him even when I don't understand the things that are going on in my world. Psalm 121 is a reminder that our relationship with God is not just based on what we can see in this life, but more importantly should be based on the identity and character of God who motivates him to do things for us. And that focus on God's identity provides an important foundation for our worship. Our understanding of God's identity motivates our relationship with him, which provides the motivating context for our worship. Worship, and I think this is very important, worship separate from that relationship with God becomes something offensive and repulsive to God. Worship that's not founded on an understanding of God's identity and character, that doesn't seek after that transformative relationship with him, is something that God rejects. We find a good illustration of that in Isaiah chapter 1. In Isaiah chapter 1, Isaiah is given a message from God to bring to his countrymen about their rebelliousness towards God. But even though he's bringing a message of rebellion and disobedience, he still acknowledges that people are worshiping. They're going to the temple, they're performing the sacrifices, they're observing the feast days. But God's response to the worship was not, well, you're still doing that, that's a good thing and I appreciate it. This was God's response, beginning in verse 11 of Isaiah chapter 1. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. When you have come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. And he goes on to talk about how he hates their worship. It's a burden to him. He's weary of bearing it, and he's going to hide his eyes from them and will not listen to their requests. Worship, separate from relationship, becomes something lifeless and offensive. And Psalm 121 reminds us that worship is founded on the things that God does for us because of who he is. And understanding what he does ought to lead us to him so that in our appreciation of his sovereign identity, we're drawn into a deeper and personal relationship with him that gives meaning and motivation to our worship and makes it a beautiful moment in which we interact with God. And I think that points to another important application for our worship. God desires that relationship with us. He desired that relationship with Israel. And our God, who sovereignly rules over this world, who makes everything, a God continues to desire a relationship with people like us, who fail him, who pursue our own selfish agendas rather than the selfless things that he wants us to do. Yet he remains committed, he remains devoted, he remains patient and forgiving. And it's those features about God's desire for a relationship with us that ought to motivate us to want to be in his presence, to want to worship him, to gather as a family and express our joy and appreciation for who he is, that allows us to be here and be together and experience something better than merely what we could ever accomplish on our own. And finally, preparing for worship then is far more than a matter of what we wear. It's far more than a matter of acting appropriately in a building. Preparing for worship is therefore about seeking a relationship with God that reorients and reorganizes our lives, that changes the way we think about life around us, the way we think about ourselves and our relationships with the people in our lives. Because of who God is, everything else is changed in our life. Because of who he is, we seek him and we orient ourselves entirely around him, and we seek to cause others to begin to do the same as we try and help them understand the good character of our God through the ways in which we are being transformed by him in our relationship with him. Worship, therefore, is not just what we do on Sundays. Worship is part of the larger life of God's people. It's a deliberate corporate expression of our acknowledgement of who he is and the ways in which we understand we're to be changed because of who he is. And that's why we're here this morning. Because we share understandings about the identity of God, about his goodness and his desire for a relationship with us. And because we also understand and share the recognition of the message in the Bible that we are people who have proved ourselves to be rebellious to his desire for a relationship. But as God announced to Moses, he is a God who is merciful, who is compassionate, who is gracious, and who is forgiving. Yes, there are consequences. There are things like the judgment for generations 2 and 3, but that's put opposite the forgiveness that extends to thousands of generations. That's the God that we serve, and that's the God whose identity motivates us to want to serve him. So this morning, if your life has not been transformed by God, if your worship is not driven by recognition of his good and holy identity, I would encourage you to explore why that might be. To accept the truth about all of us, about our identity as rebellious people, but to also understand that because of God's goodness, he offers us a chance to become different people through Jesus. Our reenactment of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection allows us to enter into a new identity that can enjoy moments like this and be transformed through moments like this. And if there are other things in your life, maybe frustrations or concerns or worries, or maybe it's the opportunity to say thanks to God, to express appreciation for the good things he's doing in your life, whatever your need might be now, you have a chance to come forward and let it be known as we stand and sing.